Okay, hey gang, welcome to the second of two videos about justice. So in the last video, we set the stage for what justice is and did that by drawing a comparison between justice and direct service or justice and charity. In this slide, I want to give you a little bit more detail about ways that people have thought about justice, particularly feminists. Feminists are very concerned with justice because feminists know that things like sexism, things like patriarchy, things like misogyny are often root causes for many of the social problems that we as a society wrestle with. And so they're very interested in wanting to address those root causes and not simply and exclusively respond to the problems or the needs or the symptoms those things create. So in this movie, or excuse me, in this little clip, I'm going to explain to you ways of thinking about justice and as much as possible use the COVID-19 example. So three big broad brushstrokes ways of thinking about justice. One would be giving each their due, figuring out what each person is owed to them by virtue of their humanity. This is a way of thinking about justice that's often very much rooted in the human rights tradition. A second way of thinking about this, and this is much more biblical, it comes from the Hebrew Bible, in fact, is living in right relationship with God and others. That justice is a relational idea, a relational characteristic or requirement of being human, and that living in right relationship, balanced relationships with others and with God is a critical demand or the basic demand of justice. And the last way of thinking about justice would be in terms of fairness, making sure that our social systems and social structures are set up to promote fairness. So thinking about this in the context of COVID-19, for example, we can see that while these are helpful definitions, they're actually pretty tricky and actually leave a lot of room for interpretation. We know, for example, that we have limited supplies of things like personal protective equipment for healthcare providers like doctors or nurses, or we know that we have limited amounts of tests available, or we know that we have limited amounts of ventilators. So trying to figure out what the demands of justice are right now, how do we give each person their due when we don't have enough to give? How do we ensure that we're living in right relationship with people when we do have limited resources? How do we figure out what is fair? This is the work of justice, and this is some of the things that folks in the healthcare context are wrestling with right now. So to that end, I want to give you 6 different ways very quickly that paradigms or models of thinking about what justice is to help, again, apply to this context. So the first would be commutative justice. And the key word to think about with commutative justice is just the word of contracts. So, for example, the justice that exists between us in our class is really one of commutative justice by virtue of our syllabus. Our syllabus is a contract. I have agreed to offer these things and provide these things and do these things. And by taking the class and enrolling in the class, you have agreed to do certain things on your end. And that we even created a covenant that helps us live in right relationship in the context of that contract. Commutative justice is an agreement between two parties who agree on and sign on to a set of terms for how they're going to relate to one another. Distributive justice is really about how do we go about figuring out what is owed to people. How do we distribute social goods and social bads? So again, right now in this COVID pandemic, there are a lot of concerns about how are we going to distribute limited goods like personal protective equipment or ventilators. And in this area of distributive justice, there's a number of theories or ways of approaching this. And you might have learned of some of these in your philosophy class. We could distribute these things equally. We could distribute them by need. We could distribute them by the people who are most worthy of receiving them. Again, all the different ways of thinking about this, but this is a very real question right now as we start to figure out how we're going to distribute things like limited healthcare resources. A third way of thinking about justice is through the lens of retributive justice. And this is really the way of thinking about justice that happens in the context of our criminal justice system. So that's why you see the scales there, which is a symbol really of justice in our criminal justice system. that somehow a state of justice is when there is a balance in the two scales. And when those scales become imbalanced, something needs to be done to one group of people or one person in order to right a kind of wrong. So this is often considered an eye for an eye approach to justice, which is also very biblical. But the idea being, if someone has harmed another person, the scales are no longer balanced, and something has to be done to the offender or the perpetrator of that harm in order to bring the scales of justice back into equilibrium or into balance. So this is often a very prevailing way of thinking about justice in our society, the exclusive way of thinking about justice in our society when it comes to criminal justice. A third way of thinking about justice would be to think about it in the context of social justice. And ultimately, social justice is the ability to contribute your gifts and your talents to a community, and to help build up the goods of a life in community, but then also to be able to participate in the benefits of life in community, to participate in the goods that come from that. So this is something that we're feeling really acutely right now as a country, because we have so many folks who are unemployed, right, who are not able to contribute their gifts to the goods of life and community. And in fact, the goods of our own life and community have been narrowed very much to focus exclusively on health. But we know even in that realm, there's so many people who are not able to contribute, and nor are they able to participate in the benefits of life and community. We have seen the way in which our own ability to connect and live in community has been so restricted by these quarantines. And we know that that hasn't been evenly the pains of that have not been evenly distributed, because we know that there are some people who suffer really acutely from that right now. So I think the key thing about social justice is the ability to contribute to community and to then get the benefits of life in community. A fourth way we could think about this, and it's kind of connected, or it's a corrective in some ways to the retributive justice model, is to think about restorative justice and thinking about a notion of flourishing, that the goal of restorative justice is that all people and communities are able to flourish. And so in the context of crime, the people who do work in restorative justice will say that crime is something that certainly impacts a victim, but it also impacts a community, and it also impacts an offender. And how do you restore all three of those different entities to a state of flourishing, recognizing that they're probably all very interdependent on one another anyway? So it's about reestablishing relationships and right relationships between communities and offenders, between offenders and victims, between victims and communities, right? And that, restorative justice is sort of this sweet spot in the middle where the three overlap. There's some really fascinating work being done on restorative justice and the arts here in Philadelphia through the Mural Arts Program, trying to do artwork in prison that heal communities, heal offenders, and heal victims, create right relationships among those three. And then here's the last, which I think is really, really fascinating, and it's an emerging edge of justice, this notion of transformative justice. And I think you can look at the three or four ideas about transformative justice. But I think the main idea here, and again, this comes specifically from feminists, comes from Black feminists, is that some of the groundwork or some of the basic assumptions that underlie, let's say, commutative justice or distributive justice or even social justice, is that these ways of thinking about justice work within the existing frameworks of societies. And transformative justice wants to say, maybe some of those existing frameworks or some of those structures or some of those systems themselves are so fundamentally flawed that we need to reimagine them completely, that we need to overhaul them completely, that the structures and the systems themselves don't just need to be tweaked or don't just need to be tinkered with in order to make them work more efficiently or allow for more flourishing, but they themselves are a source of injustice. And so there's a lot of very innovative work being done in transformative justice. And then lastly, let me just give you a quick slide of just a whole bunch of folks. This woman, I really encourage you to perhaps follow her on Instagram. Adrienne Marie Brown is a major thinker behind that notion of transformative justice that I was just telling you about. Martha Nussbaum does a lot of work in what we would call restorative justice, as does Robin Boosman. She is an artist with the Mural Arts program here in Philadelphia. Audre Lorde would be somebody who has done a fair amount in really critiquing things like retributive justice in the context of mass incarceration. You've already read some stuff by Ada Maria Asasi Diaz, right at the beginning of the semester, and the 5 Faces of Oppression. She and M.T. Davila, who is another Latina feminist, I would say do some really important work on social justice, right? What does it mean to participate and contribute to life and community? So this gives you some context for when you read both Plaskow and Margaret Farley for this week, to understand when they're talking about justice, what is it exactly that they're talking about? Thanks for your attention, and yeah, feel free to reference any of this in our discussion boards. Okay, thanks.